Okay, this lecture is going to be a fairly short lecture. I just want to look at conditionals and biconditionals a little bit deeper and introduce some words that I did not introduce in the previous lecture. Okay, so let's start by looking at this. Okay, so what can you say when you see that? There's several different ways you can read that. The most obvious, well, one of the most obvious, is to say if P, well, actually, wait, I'm gonna save that one. Let's write this one first. P implies Q. Okay? And another very common way of reading that is to say if P, then Q. Those are the two most common, but there are other ways you can read that as well. For instance, you can say Q if P. That sounds a little awkward, but it's actually not when you think about it. Let's look at this example. What if I said to you, if it's cold, then I will wear a jacket? Isn't it the same thing to say, I will wear a jacket if it's cold? So if P, then Q is the same as saying Q if P. It's actually not that weird at all to say it that way. Okay? But I can think of a few more ways of saying it. We could say, now this one's not as obvious. P only if Q. That one's not very obvious. So how can I explain to you that phrasing right there? I think the best way is to look at the truth table for P implies Q. All right, let's look at that. Let me remind you of how that truth table looks. If P is true and Q is true, then P implies Q is true. If P is true and Q is false, then P implies Q is false. If P is false and Q is true, then P implies Q is true. And if P is false and Q is false, then P implies Q is true. So I want to remind you, the only time that an implication is false is if the hypothesis is true and the conclusion is false. Okay, now, for the time being, let's just look at the first two rows. I'm just trying to explain this phrase to you right there, and all I need to do is look at the first two rows. So I'm going to get the other two out of our way. Okay, so if the implication is true, then the only way P could be true is if Q is also true. Okay, so really I just needed to look at the first row. I'm going to repeat what I said, and I want you to listen for the word only. If the implication is true, then the only way for P to be true is if Q is also true. Okay? So if we are given this, then we get to have P be true only if Q is also true. And there you heard the words only if. P is true only if Q is true, if we are given the implication. Okay? All right. Now, there's two more ways I would like to cover. Okay, these sound a little bit more fancy. Look at this line right here. Q if P. So that means that Q is going to happen if P happens. In other words, P causes Q, which is very similar to this line right here. So P causes Q to happen. In other words, if you would like Q to happen, then it is enough to make P happen. Or a better way of saying it, it is sufficient to make P happen. So we can say P is a sufficient condition for Q. Okay? Now the other side of that is this. Look at that line again. P only if Q. So that means if you want P, then you must have Q. Or in other words, if you want P, then it is necessary to also have Q. So I can say Q is a necessary condition for P. Whoops, I almost wrote Q again. So there you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different ways to read that line. Okay? Now, let's write Q implies P right here. And let's translate that in the 6 different ways that we did over on the left. So one way is to say Q implies P. One way is to say if Q, then P. I can say P if Q. I can say Q only if P. I can say Q is a sufficient condition for P, or P is a necessary condition for Q. Okay? Now, let me ask you a question. Are these two things logically the same? The answer is, of course, no. They're very different. And if you ever need to convince yourself of that, just use the phrase, my car is out of gas, for P, and my car will not run, for Q. Then this one would say, if my car is out of gas, then it will not run. And that would be true. And this one would say, if my car will not run, then it's out of gas. And that is not true, because I can have a full gas tank and still have a car that doesn't run, for instance, if I take out the spark plugs. So it's possible for one of those to be true and the other to be false, and that's enough to convince you that those two circled statements are not identical. Okay? The relationship that they have is called, they are converses. Whoops, what just happened there? They are converse of each other. And two converse statements are not equivalent. So if you want to say both of them, you certainly can, but the point is, if you want to say both of them, then you must say both of them. You can't say one and think that that's going to cover them both. Okay? So if you want P and Q to imply each other, then you have to actually say both of those, and that's where we get what we talked about last time as well, the biconditional. That's where that comes from. Okay? So let's translate that in several different ways. We're not going to do it in 6 different ways, but let's do it in a few different ways. Okay? So when you see this, so one way to read it, and this is kind of wordy, but it's certainly accurate, is to say P and Q imply each other. Okay, or P implies Q and Q implies P. How about I'll write it that way? P implies Q and Q implies P, because that's literally what it means. But I'm wondering if there's an easier way to say that. I could certainly say P and Q imply, whoops, each other, but that's not much shorter. Okay. What I could do is say this. This will save me some time. So I'm wanting to say this. That and that. And why don't I do that this way? How about if for this one right here, P implying Q, let's write that. P only if Q. And for this one, Q implying P, let's choose that wording. P if Q. Now this sounds a little bit clumsy, but that's okay. We're going to clean it up a little bit. Okay. So when I have the biconditional between P and Q, it is possible for me to read it this way. P only if Q and P if Q. Okay, now, how about if I just try to use a little bit better grammar on that? So first of all, let's just swap those two. Okay? And write it this way. P if Q and P only if Q. Okay, that I think sounds a little bit better at least. But you know what I notice? P is at the beginning of the first half and the second half of the sentence. And if Q is at the end of both halves. So how about if I just put them together instead of saying P if Q and P only if Q? What if we combine them and say P if and only if Q? That sounds much nicer. P if and only if Q. That is a nice way of saying the biconditional. And it's even nicer because there's an abbreviation for if and only if, which is IFF. Don't try to make sense of that because it doesn't make sense. If it made sense, it would be IOI, but it's not. It's IFF is supposed to stand for if and only if. Okay? And one more. If you like the words necessary and sufficient, we can use those. And how about if we do this? How about if we combine, let's see, so let me write again. This is what we're translating. So, for this half, let's use the word sufficient and say P is a sufficient condition for Q. All right, let me write that down. Whoops. And then for this half, let's use the necessary translation. So it would say, and P is a necessary condition for Q. Now that's a hugely long sentence, right? But again, notice that the sentence has two halves, and the two halves look very similar. They both start with P is A, and they both end with condition for Q. So why don't we put them together and say P is a, I'm going to go in alphabetical order and put necessary first and then sufficient. P is a necessary and sufficient condition for Q. Okay, and there we go. So there's 4 different common ways of reading a biconditional. Okay, so you have conditionals, can be often translated in 6 different ways. There are others. We could come up with 100 different ways if we want, but these 6 are the common ways of reading a conditional statement. And there's 4 common ways for reading a biconditional statement. The easiest for biconditionals, the easiest is to write it this way and use the IFF abbreviation, and the fanciest is to say this. Okay, now that's going to help you in your homework for section 2.4. And that's all I want to do today, even though that was a short lecture.